Tamerlane and the Boy, written by Tom and Tony Bradman, illustrated by Arpad Olby. Chapter 1. The autumn sun was shining when Kioni and his father arrived in the village. It was market day, and they had come to sell their fruit crop, the sacks of apples and pears heaped in the back of their cart. They found their usual spot, unhitched the 2 oxen from the cart, and quickly started doing a brisk trade. The market square was in the middle of the village, and it was crowded with people who had come to buy. One man was selling lamb grilled over a fire pit, and the rich smell filled the air. Kioni planned to buy something too, but not for himself. His little sister, Azar, had begged him to get her a present, and he could never say no to her. As the day went on and business grew quieter, Kioni's father said he could go and have a look round. There was so much noise and so much to look at, it was hard to choose. Then Kioni saw a stall selling wooden dolls in colorful dresses, and he knew Azar would love one. He had some coins he'd saved, and he haggled with the stall owner to get a good price. As he returned to their stall, Kioni saw his father talking to an old farmer friend of theirs. Kioni was not surprised. Half the fun of market day, at least for the grown-ups, was catching up with friends and hearing all the latest news and gossip. But the old farmer looked very worried. "I'm telling you," he said, pointing his finger at Kioni's father, "Tamerlane is heading right for us. His army is bigger than ever, and nothing can stand in its way. We should flee before it's too late." "Oh, I don't think so," said Kioni's father. "I heard he's only crossing Georgia so he can attack some other warlord. We're just farmers. He won't be a threat to us." Kioni knew about Tamerlane the Great. Even though he had a limp from an old wound suffered in his childhood and had lost 2 of his fingers, he was the greatest warlord of them all. His army had swept out of the Central Asian steppes, defeating all who stood in his way. Now he ruled a vast empire, from Samarkand in the north to Baghdad in the west, and Delhi in the east, and down to the Persian Gulf in the south. The nearby stallholders listened to the conversation. Most of them agreed with Kioni's father. What would Tamerlane want with poor, humble folk like them? The old farmer glared at them, his temper growing. "You are all fools," he said. "You will be sorry if you don't leave." He turned to walk away, his patience with them finally snapping. But then he stopped and rounded on them once more. "You mark my words," he said. "Tamerlane won't stop until he rules the whole world." Kioni's father just laughed and shook his head. They went home in the afternoon, back to the farm that was the only home Kioni had ever known. Beyond the farm stood the high snow-covered peaks of the Caucasus Mountains. Surely even Tamerlane the Great couldn't march an army over those, Kioni thought. But Azar loved her new doll, and that made Kioni smile. So he thought no more about armies and warlords. But just 3 days later, Kioni looked out of his window and saw a distant column of smoke rising into the blue sky. By the afternoon, there were 2 more columns, much closer to the farm. Kioni's parents stood in the doorway of their farmhouse, looking southwards. "What does it mean, husband?" said Kioni's mother. "Should we be afraid?" "Of course not," said Kioni's father. "It has been a dry summer, so those are probably brush fires. We'd better round up the sheep and put them in the pen tonight." Kioni wished he could be so sure. The smoke looked like it might be rising from the village and the 2 nearest farms. But Kioni kept that to himself and went with his father to bring their flock in from the pasture for the night. They ate in silence that evening, all of them worried, but not saying anything about what they were thinking. At last, night fell and they went to bed, although Kioni could hear that his parents were as restless as him. After a long time, he managed to fall asleep. Tamerlane's warriors came with the rising of the sun. Chapter 2. It was the thundering of horses' hooves that woke them. Kioni's father opened the farmhouse door and looked out. Kioni leapt from his bed and peeked from behind him. Kioni's blood froze in his veins. A dozen mounted warriors were gathered in front of the house. Hard-faced men in leather and fur and steel armor, their horses panting and snorting and stamping. The warriors carried swords and spears and small bows, and some held torches, the red flames bright in the morning light. "Welcome, strangers," said Kioni's father, his voice shaking. He pushed Kioni back and stepped further out. "Why have you come here? Do you want something?" "Our lord and master Tamerlane has given us a special task," said one of the men, nudging his horse forwards. "We have come to kill you and burn your farm." Kioni's father stared at him, unable to believe what he had just heard. "But why?" he said. "Why would a great warlord bother with us and our small farm?" "So that all will know to fear us," said the man. Then Kioni's father was dragged away. Kioni heard a scream that was cut short, and he knew his father was dead. Kioni slammed the door shut and turned to see his mother and Azar right behind him. His mother's face was white with shock and fear, and Azar was crying, her new doll clutched tightly to her chest. He could hear the warriors outside. They were whooping and calling and riding around. Then he heard something very frightening, the sound of a torch landing on the farmhouse's thatched roof. "Quick, we must run," he said, as the flames began to crackle. The farmhouse only had one long room, but there was a cellar they could get to through a trap door in the floor. Kioni pulled the trap door open, and they climbed down, his mother carrying Azar. This was the cellar they used as a store for their crops. On the far side was another trap door that would let them out into the orchard. Kioni lifted it and looked cautiously around. The warriors were still in front of the farmhouse. Their way was clear, but they needed to move fast. "Quick," he said, helping his mother climb up out the trap door with Azar. "Go quietly. Now," he whispered to his sister, who was starting to whimper. Moments later, Kioni and his mother and sister were running through the orchard and into the forest behind it. Kioni turned once to look back and saw the farmhouse burning. A thick column of black smoke rose into the sky to join the others. They stopped after a while and held on to each other, weeping. But then Kioni's mother wiped her tears away and said they had to keep going. "We are not safe here in the lowlands," she said. "We must find somewhere to hide in the mountains." So they stumbled on, taking turns to carry Azar when she grew tired. Dark clouds appeared in the sky, and the rain fell, soaking them to the skin. They kept following the path upwards until they reached a landscape of rocks and cliffs of stone. Eventually, they found a small hut, the kind that shepherds used when the weather was bad. Kioni's mother said they would have to shelter there for the night. There was a stream nearby, so they had water to drink. But they had no food, and Kioni knew it would get very cold when the sun went down. Like most country boys, he knew how to make a fire with a couple of sharp flints and some twigs, and it wasn't long before he had a warm fire going. That evening, they sat huddled round the fire's warmth, their clothes steaming as they dried. They wept again, until Kioni's mother said they should try to sleep. But Azar was restless. saying one minute that she was hot and shivering the next. Soon, she started coughing. It was clear she wasn't very well at all. Chapter 3. Kioni's mother stayed awake most of the night to watch over Azar. Kioni didn't sleep much either. His heart was full of grief for his father and anger with him for not listening to the man who had said they should flee. That made him feel guilty, so he concentrated on hating Tamerlane's warriors, and Tamerlane himself, of course. He was really the one to blame. But Kioni mostly worried about his little sister. Morning came. Azar was sleeping, still holding on tightly to her new doll. "What are we going to do, Mother?" Kioni said, speaking quietly. "We can't stay here." "We have to," said his mother. "Azar needs a few days of rest in the warm. We can't drag her all over the mountains. That would only make her worse. At home, I would give her plenty to eat to build up her strength. If only we had some food." "I will go and find some," Kioni said eagerly. "Tamerlane's warriors can't have burned every farm and village. I'm sure somebody will be able to help us." "No, Kioni, I don't want you to put yourself in danger," said his mother. "It would be much better if I go, while you stay here to take care of your little sister." "But you're the best one to do that," said Kioni. "You know what to do, and I don't. You've always taken care of us. I can probably travel faster than you as well." Kioni's mother argued for a while longer before she gave up. "My brave boy," she said at last, kissing him. "Just be careful and stay away from those men." "I will, Mother," said Kioni, "and I promise that I will be as quick as I can." Kioni set off, running back down the path they had followed the day before. Dark clouds filled the sky, and swathes of mist clung like giant clumps of wool to the mountain peaks. As he ran, Kioni thought about what he should do. He decided to go back to their farm first. They had always kept a store of food in the cellar: dried meat, preserved fruit from the orchard, some cheeses. Maybe it hadn't all been burnt in the fire. A haze of smoke still hung over the farm, where things were worse than he had imagined. The farmhouse had been utterly destroyed, and so had the orchard. There would never be any more apples and pears growing fatter and firmer as they ripened in the sun. The larger trees had been hacked down, the smaller ones uprooted and left to rot, and all the animal pens were empty. Their sheep and oxen were gone. Kioni stood there for a moment, fighting back the tears. The house had collapsed in a tangle of charred roof timbers and rubble, and he realized there was no point in even looking in the cellar. He would have to try a neighbor's farm or the village. Kioni paused briefly and said a prayer for his father, then hurried on. It wasn't long before he began to realize he was wasting his time. Every farm he came to had been burned and looted, and so had the village. He saw no people either. Tamerlane's warriors had swept over the land, destroying everything in their path. Although perhaps not quite everything. Kioni saw the tracks of the stolen herds and flocks the warriors had taken with them. As the sun began to set, he came to a small hill and climbed up it, breathing hard, his legs aching. A rocky outcrop marked the hilltop, and Kioni looked over it, hoping to see a farm that hadn't been destroyed. But instead, he saw a vast camp of tents and warriors and horses, and so many campfires he couldn't possibly count them. Tamerlane's army lay before him. Chapter 4. Kioni ducked back behind the rocky outcrop and hoped that he hadn't been seen. He felt a surge of anger. Many of Tamerlane's warriors were singing, celebrating their great victory over his people, a victory that had left his father dead and his family homeless. He wanted to run down and scream his hate at them, but he knew that would surely be the end of him, and then he wouldn't be able to help Azar. He carefully raised his head and looked again. The warriors at the nearest fire were roasting a whole sheep on a spit, and the smell made the juices flow in Kioni's mouth. Somewhere ahead, in among all those tents and campfires, other warriors were probably roasting a sheep or an ox that had been raised on his family's land. An animal that could keep his sister and mother and him alive with its flesh for a month. Further on, he could see dozens of animal pens, each one packed with more sheep and goats and cattle. Beyond them was a line of big ox-drawn wagons loaded with sacks of fruit and vegetables and flour and salt and grain, all of it looted, no doubt. Kioni thought for a moment. Everything he needed for Azar lay before him, but how could he get it? He looked round at the sky and saw that the sun would soon dip behind the mountains. It would be properly dark before long. He would just have to wait, then sneak down to the wagons without being spotted. His stomach turned over with fear, but he knew this was what he had to do for Azar. Eventually, the sun disappeared and darkness flooded across the plain, making the campfires seem to glow more brightly. It was now or never, Kioni thought. He took a deep breath and climbed over the outcrop, dropping softly to the ground below. Keeping low, silent as a cat, he padded softly from rock to ditch to tuft of long grass. Then he saw that there were figures in the darkness ahead, and he stopped. They were guards, men in leather and fur, grumbling and laughing and talking in languages he couldn't understand. Their spearheads gleamed in the firelight, and swords hung from their belts. They stood in groups of 4 or 5, 100 paces out from the edge of the camp, not expecting an attack, feeling secure in their strength, each group too far from the others to see the boy who crept between them towards the wagons. Kioni felt his anger return. He felt that he wanted to avenge himself against these arrogant warriors, even if it was only in his own small way, even if it was just as a pinprick on an elephant's hide. Perhaps he could start a blaze, set a few tents burning. Perhaps he could open one of the pens, free some of the animals so that they would stampede through the camp, then drive a few into the night that he could round up later. He paused and lay down on the grass to get his bearings. He was very close to the wagons now. They couldn't be more than 20 paces away. His best chance would be to cover the distance in a final dash, he decided. He took a deep breath, rose to his feet, took one last look, and sprinted. But just as he reached the first wagon, a flaming torch suddenly appeared out of the darkness, the light dazzling him. He collided with something big, something that grunted at him. Kioni was knocked to the ground and realized that he had run into a warrior. The man held the torch in one hand and his sword in the other, the blade glinting in the light. Kioni couldn't take his eyes off it, terrified of what could happen. Chapter 5. For a brief instant, Kioni believed he was about to die. But the warrior didn't kill him, so Kioni turned and tried to crawl away into the darkness. He didn't get very far. The warrior dropped his torch and grabbed him by the ankle. Kioni fought to shake his leg free, but the man was far too strong and simply dragged him back like a shepherd would drag a lamb to the slaughter. Then he stood over him, glaring, his sword held high. "Who are you?" growled the warrior. "Have you been sent to spy on us?" Kioni said nothing. The warrior put his sword back into its scabbard and pulled Kioni roughly to his feet. He held on to Kioni's arm and shook him until his teeth rattled. "Come on, speak up, boy," he yelled. Other warriors soon appeared, and they stood round Kioni in a tight circle, staring at him curiously, their eyes cold and hard. "And what is going on here?" said a loud, commanding voice. The warriors instantly fell to their knees and bowed their heads. Kioni was left standing alone, looking at the man who had spoken. He was tall and wore rich armor over his fine silk tunic. A sword hung from his belt, the hilt made of ivory, the leather scabbard covered in a swirling pattern of gold and sparkling jewels. But Kioni saw that he limped as he walked, and 2 fingers were missing from his right hand. I caught this boy trying to sneak into the camp, my lord," said the warrior Kioni had run into, his voice trembling. "I'm sure that he must be a spy." "Is that true, boy?" said the tall man. "Tell the truth, and you might save your life." So this was Tamerlane, the great warlord, Kioni thought, and his anger burst out of him. "I am no spy," he hissed. "The truth is that your warriors killed my father and burnt our farm. Yes, I sneaked into your camp, but that was only to take back some of the food you have stolen from my people. I need it for my mother and my sister, who is sick. And I tell you this, Tamerlane, I would kill you here and now if I could." There was a sharp intake of breath from the warriors. Several shouted angrily at Kioni and drew their swords as if they wanted to kill him on the spot. But Tamerlane frowned and stopped them in their tracks with a simple gesture of his hand. "Put your swords away," he growled, and the warriors instantly did as they were told. Kioni raised his chin and held the warlord's gaze. Eventually, Tamerlane nodded, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. "What is your name, boy?" he said quietly, and Kioni told him. "I was a boy like you once," said Tamerlane, "a brave boy who had to steal to keep his family alive. That's how I gained a limp and lost 2 fingers." "What is that to me?" said Kioni angrily, "or to my mother and sister?" "It means that I see myself in you, so I will let you live," said Tamerlane. The great warlord did more than just that, though. The next day, he took Kioni back to his mother and sister, accompanied by 50 warriors of his bodyguard. He brought his personal doctor as well, a man called Dakshan, to look at Azar. Kioni's mother was frightened at first, but relieved to see Kioni, and even more relieved when Dakshan gave Azar some medicine and said she would recover. Tamerlane had also given orders for the farmhouse to be rebuilt, the orchard replanted, the pens to be filled with sheep and goats and oxen once more. "Live long and prosper, Kioni of Georgia," said Tamerlane at last, looking down on the boy from his horse, his armor gleaming in the sun. "I will remember you." "I will remember you too," said Kioni. But Tamerlane had already turned and ridden away, his warriors following in a cloud of thundering hooves and dust. He still had a world to conquer. Tamerlane and the boy. After Kioni's life is struck by tragedy, how will he save his little sister? And how will he react when he meets his enemy?